This podcast from the UNESCO Inclusive Policy Lab is part of a series of short discussions about different themes arising from the work of the lab and the Inclusive Development Agenda. In this podcast, we discuss the context of inclusive development and introduce the inclusive policy markers. We also discuss how the markers, and thereby the lab, provide an enabling environment in which to help further the inclusive development agenda. Striving for a world that is just, equitable and inclusive has long been a commitment of the international community. Following extensive consultations and negotiations, inclusive social development and the associated policy agenda emerged as the core of the recently adopted Sustainable Development Goals. 6 out of 17 Sustainable Development Goals are dedicated to such a change. Despite their strength at the discourse levels, inclusive social development and inclusive policy are evolving agendas that remain largely underanalyzed and non-operationalized in policy and programmatic terms. A unified and widely accepted definition of inclusive development has not yet been articulated. There is a common understanding of what it stands for, which transpires from discussions of the 2030 Agenda, but such understanding needs further conceptual and operational delineation to avoid its indiscriminate and empty use. The working definition used by the Inclusive Policy Lab approaches inclusive development as a framework for public action that has the two-pronged goal of adequate inclusion of all concerned parties in the process of policy design and delivery, so inclusive in means, and at the same time of producing the outcome of inclusion, inclusive in ends. In this sense, increased attention is paid to the substantive provisions of inclusive policy, the process of its design and delivery, and its format. The inclusive policy markers provide a tool with which to operationalise the inclusive development agenda. Inclusive development is not a sectoral intervention, but a portfolio of interventions. No standalone policy can achieve inclusion. It is brought about through a system of policies that operate concurrently and in an integrated manner along the social, economic, political, civic and cultural axes. This policy agenda is transformative in nature. It entails, as such, revision of the current modes of policy analysis, design and delivery at all levels. If we take, for example, 3 different policymakers who work in different fields, different continents and on different jobs, but who are all concerned with inclusive development and how it can and should be practically approached through policies, they have specific questions such as, what is the inclusive policy agenda? What do these policies have in common? What makes them inclusive? What can they do when they need to go outside of a standard toolbox or menu of inclusive policies and design new policies? What should they watch out for in terms of the pitfalls of exclusion? In other words, many of them struggle with the question, how can inclusive development be operationalised through policy and programmes? UNESCO's response to these needs is the inclusive policy markers. The markers are, in essence, quality and process-related parameters against which the inclusive character of a given policy or an entire portfolio of interventions can be weighed. The markers are not intended for ranking policies or creating typologies. They are also not intended to be used to decide if a policy has more weight or deserves a stronger emphasis than another. Just as inclusive development is multidimensional and cross-sectoral, so the markers are not sectoral either. They are rather transversal and applicable to multiple sectoral policies. They are also determined, amongst other factors, by specific patterns of exclusion in various jurisdictions, the desired inclusion outcomes, as well as institutional setup and policy specificities. The markers can also be used as instruments to build capacity, design policy audits, experiment and crowdsource solutions to issues that policy practitioners might be facing. Using the markers offers quality and process-related safeguards to ensure that policies are both inclusive in design and produce inclusive outcomes. So the markers take you through Step 1, 6 dimensions of inclusive development to grasp inequalities and exclusion. They are the core components of inclusive policy development. Step 2, 20 quality and process safeguards to make policies inclusive in design and outcomes. These tell the user what each and every one of the dimensions implies in policy terms. Step 3 is 55 design examples to help put safeguards in place. Each of the design examples includes a detailed checklist to guide the user in inclusive policy development. The result is that the markers help you construct inclusive, equity-weighted, and SDG-oriented policies. On the basis of the online tool, the users can build capacity in the areas of inclusive development, conduct an informal DIY policy assessment, design a full-scale shared policy audit, and crowdsource and diffuse policy solutions they may hold themselves. Inclusive development is an evolving agenda that remains largely underanalyzed and non-operationalized in policy and programmatic terms. These pending tasks become urgent with the adoption and implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. In this way, the inclusive policy markers are a tool with which to operationalize the inclusive development agenda.